New Year's Eve has always been about looking forward. It is the moment when people pause and imagine what comes next. When they speak about plans. When they allow themselves to believe that the year ahead can be shaped. In peaceful times, this comes naturally. The future feels available. Predictable enough to discuss. But there were years when looking forward felt dangerous. Years when people celebrated the arrival of a new year without knowing whether the next months, or even the next days, would unfold as expected. In those moments, New Year's Eve changed its meaning. It was no longer about anticipation. It became about presence. About marking time not because it promised improvement, but because surviving to see another year already felt significant. Across different centuries, in different countries, people found themselves welcoming the new year under conditions that stripped the moment down to its simplest form. No certainty. No long-term plans. No confidence in what tomorrow would bring. Only the quiet recognition that time had continued, even when life had been interrupted. Historical letters and diaries often describe these nights differently. There is little celebration in their words. Very few mentions of joy. Instead, there is careful attention to small details. A candle still burning. A shared meal, modest and improvised. A clock being watched more closely than usual. For many, the arrival of the new year was not announced loudly. It arrived quietly, sometimes almost unnoticed, carried by routine rather than ritual. The calendar changed. The environment did not. And yet, people remembered those nights vividly. Not because of what happened, but because of what did not. No fireworks. No crowds filling the streets. No clear sense that the new year marked a fresh beginning. What remained was the act of gathering, often in small spaces, with familiar faces, holding on to ordinary gestures that suddenly felt important. In such moments, New Year's Eve stopped being symbolic. It became practical. A pause. A breath. A way to acknowledge that time had moved forward, even if life felt suspended. Many wrote later that the most striking part of those nights was how normal they tried to make them feel. How someone insisted on setting a table properly. How a piece of food was saved for the moment after midnight. How people avoided speaking about the future directly, as if naming it might make it fragile. These were not nights defined by fear. They were defined by restraint. By choosing not to ask questions that had no answers. By focusing instead on what could still be controlled. A shared space. A shared moment. A shared understanding that being together, even briefly, mattered more than celebration itself. This is what it felt like to welcome a new year when the future could not be planned, only endured. Not with optimism. Not with despair. But with quiet attention to the present, and the hope that simply reaching midnight was already enough. You are in a city shaped by an earlier century. The buildings are older. The streets narrower. Light comes from lamps, candles, and windows rather than from signs or screens. Winter has already settled in. Snow lies unevenly along the streets, darkened by days of footsteps. Ice gathers along the edges of stone and wood. This is not a place preparing for celebration. It is a place conserving energy. Shops close earlier than usual. Not out of tradition, but necessity. Supplies are limited. Nothing is wasted. Inside homes, rooms feel smaller in winter. People gather closer together, not for comfort, but for warmth. Coats stay on longer than they normally would. Gloves are placed carefully nearby, ready to be used again. Heat is uneven. Some corners of a room remain cold no matter how long a stove burns. Metal objects are avoided. Wood is preferred. Everything that retains warmth becomes valuable. Outside, streets are quieter than they would be in other years. Not empty, just restrained. Movement is deliberate. People walk with purpose. There is little wandering. Public spaces no longer invite lingering. They are passed through, not occupied. Windows glow softly in the early evening. Curtains are drawn sooner. Light is treated carefully, as something to be preserved rather than displayed. Inside these rooms, life continues in reduced form. Meals are simpler. Portions smaller. Ingredients chosen for practicality rather than variety. People speak more quietly. Not because they are afraid of being overheard, but because raising one's voice feels unnecessary. The city does not feel abandoned. It feels inward. Attention shifts from the outside world to immediate surroundings. To walls. To tables. To familiar faces. Time moves more slowly here. Not because clocks have stopped, but because days contain fewer interruptions. There are no large gatherings filling the streets. No decorations announcing the season. What remains are personal spaces, where the meaning of New Year's must be created privately. In letters written during these winters, people often describe the environment before describing themselves. The cold. The dim light. The stillness. They write about how the city sounded. Not loud, but contained. How evenings arrived early. How silence settled faster than expected. The absence of public celebration does not erase the awareness of the date. It sharpens it. People know exactly what night this is. They simply acknowledge it differently. This city is not waiting for something to happen. It is waiting for something to pass. And in that waiting, daily life becomes careful, measured, intentional. Every action feels slightly more deliberate than usual. Not because of fear, but because uncertainty encourages attention. This is the environment in which the new year approaches. Not as a promise, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet marker in time. Noticed by those who are paying close attention, and allowed to pass without drawing attention to itself. The day before New Year's does not feel like a celebration. It feels like preparation. But not for a holiday. Preparation for getting through the evening. For making the hours pass in a way that feels familiar. People wake earlier than usual. Not because they slept well, but because rest comes lightly in uncertain times. There are small tasks to attend to. Not many. But each one feels important. Someone checks what food remains. Not to plan a feast, but to see what can be saved for later. A piece of bread is set aside. A jar opened carefully. Ingredients are measured with more attention than usual. Nothing extravagant is attempted. The goal is not abundance. It is continuity. In many households, someone insists on cooking something warm. Even if portions are small. Even if ingredients are missing. The act itself matters. A pot on the stove. Steam rising. The familiar sound of water heating. These details appear often in letters and diaries. Not because they were remarkable, but because they were grounding. Conversation avoids certain topics. People speak about the day. About weather. About small repairs. About things that can be handled. The future is approached indirectly. Plans are vague. Sentences trail off before becoming specific. It is not avoidance. It is care. Words are chosen carefully. As if speaking too precisely about tomorrow might make it fragile. There are pauses in conversation that linger longer than usual. Not uncomfortable. Just unfilled. Silence becomes part of the rhythm of the day. Children sense the difference. They notice the absence of decoration. The quieter voices. The way adults glance at clocks without comment. Still, small gestures are preserved. Someone straightens the table. Another wipes a surface that is already clean. Clothes are adjusted, even if no one outside the household will see them. These actions appear again and again in historical accounts. Not because they changed anything, but because they preserved a sense of order. As evening approaches, the light fades early. Candles are lit sooner. Lamps glow softly, creating small islands of warmth. The outside world feels distant. The inside grows more contained. People gather closer together. Not to celebrate, but to be present. There is an unspoken agreement to treat this evening differently. Not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. Food is eaten slowly. Conversation remains gentle. Time is allowed to pass without pressure. The day before New Year's becomes less about anticipation and more about preservation. Preserving routine. Preserving familiarity. Preserving the feeling of being human. In circumstances that make everything feel temporary. By the time night arrives, nothing extraordinary has happened. And that, in itself, feels meaningful. As evening turns into night, the city grows quieter. Not suddenly. Gradually. Sounds thin out one by one. Footsteps become less frequent. Doors close and stay closed. Voices retreat behind walls. What remains is not silence, but something close to it. In earlier centuries, cities were rarely quiet. There was always movement. Always background noise. Always something happening just out of sight. On nights like this, that layer fades. People begin to listen more carefully. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Ears adjust to long pauses between sounds, to the way quiet stretches without being interrupted. A distant noise carries farther than expected. A cart wheels somewhere down the street. A door closing several houses away. Each sound feels more isolated than usual, as if it exists on its own rather than as part of a larger rhythm. Inside homes, people notice small details. The crackle of a fire. The soft movement of fabric. The creak of wood as a building settles. These sounds feel louder in contrast to what is missing. Historical accounts often mention this shift. Not as something alarming, but as something unmistakable. The city sounds different tonight. People learn to distinguish between ordinary noises and those that suggest attention is needed. This listening becomes automatic. The body responds before the mind does. A pause in conversation. A glance toward a window. A moment of stillness. Then, when nothing follows, life resumes quietly. This cycle repeats throughout the night. Listening. Pausing. Continuing. It does not create tension. It creates awareness. Over time, people become accustomed to it. The body adapts to long stretches of quiet. The mind stops filling every pause with expectation. Silence becomes part of the environment. Not empty. Structured. The absence of celebration amplifies this effect. There are no festive sounds to interrupt the night. No music. No collective countdown. Midnight approaches without announcement. People notice the hour not by sound, but by routine. A clock is checked. A candle is replaced. A fire is adjusted. The moment passes without emphasis. Later, many would write that what they remembered most was not a specific sound, but the way listening changed. How the night felt longer. How attention sharpened. How stillness became something to inhabit, rather than something to endure. These nights were not remembered for what was heard, but for how carefully people listened. And in that careful listening, a strange calm often settled in. Not relief. Not comfort. But a steady awareness. That the night was being experienced fully, moment by moment, without distraction. That awareness, quiet, restrained, attentive, is what stayed with people long after the night had passed. The moment arrives without announcement. There is no countdown spoken out loud. No voices rising together. No shared signal that something important is about to happen. Time moves forward quietly. A clock reaches the hour. A calendar changes its page. A new date begins. That is all. Nothing in the city responds. The streets look the same as they did an hour ago. The light in windows does not change. The cold remains steady. In many homes, people notice the moment only because they are paying attention. Someone glances at a clock. Someone else nods briefly. A few words are exchanged. Not celebratory. Not solemn. Simple acknowledgments. It's the new year. Yes. For some, the moment passes without words at all. It is marked internally, registered and then set aside. There are no public rituals to draw attention to it. No sounds from outside to reinforce the transition. The new year begins in stillness. Historical letters often describe this moment with restraint. Writers rarely linger on it. They mention it almost in passing. The year changed quietly. Midnight came and went. We noticed, and then continued. What stands out is not what happened, but what did not. There was no sense of renewal. No illusion that the turning of the calendar altered circumstances. The new year did not promise improvement. It did not announce relief. It simply arrived. For many, this made the moment feel unusually honest. Without ceremony. The date change became a private recognition rather than a public event. People remained where they were. Seated at the same table. Wrapped in the same coats. Surrounded by the same familiar walls. Nothing reset. And yet, the act of noticing still mattered. Marking the passage of time, even quietly, was a way of asserting continuity. Of saying, time is still moving. We are still here. In some homes, a small ritual survived. A shared piece of food. A sip from a cup. A brief pause before resuming conversation. Not because tradition demanded it, but because it felt important to acknowledge the moment in some way. To let it exist. Even without celebration. The absence of spectacle did not make the moment meaningless. It made it precise. Clear. Unembellished. Later, people would remember that New Year's not for what it brought, but for how unchanged everything felt after it arrived. The same night. The same concerns. The same routines waiting for morning. But also the same presence. The same people. The same shared space. The same quiet decision to continue. In that sense, the new year did not begin with hope or despair. It began with continuity. And for those who lived through it, that continuity, unadorned and unpromising, was enough to remember. After midnight, the night continues much like before. There is no shift in atmosphere. No sense that something has been completed. No relief that arrives with the new date. People remain where they are. The same rooms. The same light. The same stillness. Conversation grows softer, then fades. Not abruptly. Naturally. Fatigue settles in, but it feels different from ordinary tiredness. It is not the exhaustion of effort. It is the weight of sustained attention. The attention required to listen. To notice. To remain present through a night that asked for restraint rather than expression. Some people sleep lightly. Others remain awake longer than usual. Not because they expect anything to happen, but because rest comes slowly after such evenings. In historical accounts, the hours after midnight are rarely described in detail. They are treated as an extension of the night. Unremarkable. Unchanged. And that is precisely what makes them meaningful. The absence of disruption becomes a kind of quiet relief. The night did not escalate. Nothing demanded immediate response. The hours passed without adding new uncertainty. For many, this realization brought a subtle sense of steadiness. Not optimism. Not reassurance. Just the understanding that another threshold had been crossed. Without consequence. Morning, when it came, did not arrive differently. Light returned as expected. The day began as it always did. And yet, people remembered that night clearly. Not because of what it changed, but because of what it revealed. That even when circumstances make the future difficult to imagine, time continues. That even when celebration feels inappropriate or impossible, acknowledgement still matters. The new year did not offer solutions. It did not carry promises. It did not signal an end. But it did confirm something quieter. That presence itself. Shared space. Shared silence. Shared attention. Was enough to carry people through the moment. In letters written long after, people often reflected on those New Year's nights. With a tone of clarity rather than emotion. They did not describe them as tragic. They did not describe them as hopeful. They described them as real. Moments stripped of symbolism. Reduced to essentials. A table. A room. A few familiar faces. A date changing quietly. And the decision, repeated without ceremony. To continue. That is what remained after midnight. Not celebration. Not despair. But continuity. The simple fact that life, even in reduced form, had moved forward. And for those who experienced it, that quiet persistence, more than any ritual, became the memory that lasted.